Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, I gather I can be heard from not only the back of the room, I hope, but also out there where we have a number of participants from over the world, fellow members, and this is by way of being an experiment, but an experiment which I think has quite a bearing on our future. It's just wonderful to see people here in real life and to have a meeting at long last of this society. I can't tell you how that pleases me and how nice it is to see you all. But also, of course, I think in future it will be possible to do something like this. And the technology that we've got now is, I hope, working. And if it is, I mean, I do need to thank our Secretary Fiona and Louise for the work that they've done to get this set up. But in future, you know, it will be possible to have meetings of the Roman Society, which people can come to London and attend, but also if they can't do that, to tune in from home, and people from around the world can do the same. In New Zealand, for instance, if they're prepared to get up at 5 in the morning. But you know what I mean, and as we've learned over the past 18 months, it is possible to organize events that can be attended in a virtual way by people around the world, and that is marvelous. Well, this afternoon we're going to be talking about Nero, the reign of Nero, and we've chosen this because it coincides with the exhibition that the British Museum has put on, which, if you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend it. It's got some stunning artifacts and a very interesting exhibition. But I should say we have been trying to get a special event for the Roman Society for members, and I'm glad to say that we have succeeded in doing that, and there will be in a few weeks' time an occasion where members can, I think it's a virtual sort of presentation by Thorsten Opper, who set up the exhibition from the British Museum, which will be for members of the Roman Society, and our Honorary Secretary, Roland, after this event, will give you further details about that. But let's get on to today's event. I'm very pleased to be able to announce our 4 speakers who will each speak for 25 minutes, half an hour. And then the way we'll do this, because there's just the one screen, we will then have time, I hope, for 1 or 2 questions afterwards for each speaker. So we'll do it like that. First speaker, questions, second speaker, questions, etc. Because it's not going to be possible to have all 4 of them on the screen at once. So we'll try and do it like that. Our 4 speakers are known to you all because, as members of the Roman Society, you have elected them in one way or another. Dominic Rathbone is a former president, and Rebecca Flemming, a former member of council. Siobhan Chomse is a current member of council, and Shushma Malik, I'm delighted to say, is going to join council at the annual general meeting in May. So you know them all, you have elected them, and you'll be able to hold them to account, I guess. But we start with Rebecca Flemming from Cambridge, who is going to, I mean, what we're going to be doing is to show you, I think, that it's not just about Nero himself, the man and the myth, as the museum's exhibition calls it, but the age of Nero, which is such a fascinating one and in some ways is a golden age. From various points of view, Rebecca is an expert, of course, on ancient medicine and on intellectual and cultural aspects of society, not only medicine, but other aspects of society of the imperial period. And she is going to be speaking about medicine in Neronian Rome, a golden age. So, Rebecca.
Okay, so thank you very much, and it's great to actually be here in person with people, but hello to all of those out in the ether as well. And this is my first, I realize this is my first in-person lecture for 18 months, so I may be a bit rusty. Forgive me if I've kind of forgotten how to do all this, but I'm going to try as best I can. Okay, so the most famous physician in Neronian Rome was, by all accounts, Thessalus of Tralles, founder of the Methodic or Methodist, but I think that's a bit confusing, so I'm going to carry on calling it the Methodic sect of medicine, or at least the founder of its most successful iteration, the guise within which it became the most successful medical grouping in Imperial Rome, much to the annoyance of its rivals. One of those rivals was Galen, the great physician of the next century, the 2nd century AD, who spent a lot of time and energy attacking Thessalus, personally, programmatically, every way you can possibly imagine. And much of the first book of his main work on therapeutics, on the method of healing, is dedicated to attacking Thessalus for being brought up in the women's quarters, for example, shamefully having a father who was a wool worker, for acquiring patients through flattering the Roman elite, for acquiring students through promising them that he could teach the whole of medicine in 6 months, and so on. Thessalus was, Galen says, outrageously disrespectful to his illustrious medical predecessors, especially Hippocrates. He invited all the world to the spectacle, to the theatron of his books. Serious tomes, Galen will admit, called things like the Koinotetes on commonalities, and that's one of the key notions of the Methodic school. And having invited the world to the theatre of his books, he then went on, Galen says, to declare himself the winner, to give himself the crown of victory over everybody else in the entire medical universe, a claim that he then repeated, Galen says, in a letter that he wrote to Nero. So this opened with the very moderate and modest assertion that I have established a new sect, hieresis sect or grouping, and it's the only one which is true, aletheia, as all doctors who came before passed on nothing useful regarding either the preservation of health or the removal of disease. Very kind of moderate and modest chap. According to Pliny the Elder, writing under the Flavians, and who hated all Greek doctors rather than just methodic ones, so a bit more balanced, this claim, Thessalus's claim of medical triumph over both past and present other physicians and members of other kind of medical groups, was really central to Thessalus's funerary monument, which was in a prominent position on the Appian Way, and on which Pliny says he described himself as the Atronices, physician conqueror. Though Pliny also emphasizes that his fame was short-lived, if intense. The fickle and very gullible Roman rich had favored Vettius Valens before him, and he was outstripped and influenced first by Crinas and then Charmis of Massilia. And indeed, it's a kind of very sorry story altogether, which doesn't reflect well on anybody, the Roman elite, their doctors, Thessalus, and so on. So both authors then foster an image of Thessalus as a showman and vigorous self-promoter, as a very combative performer who thought of his writings as theatre and attracted a larger following than any actor or charioteer. So that is, they create an image of Thessalus as essentially Neronian, if you like, as the medical match to the flamboyant performer on the imperial throne. Now, I'm sure that Thessalus was a great self-promoter, and I'm sure he gave a very good performance in any number of medical roles. That was part of being a doctor in the Roman world. Galen, exactly the same could be said of Galen. Especially in Rome itself, in the imperial capital, medicine was a very competitive enterprise. If you were ambitious, you really had to perform and compete and promote yourself in a number of different milieux. Thessalus was also a serious system builder, as I mentioned earlier. he expanded and developed the ideas of the first advocate of the medical method, Themerson of Laodicea, back in the 1st century BC, and indeed was very much recognized as doing so by those who come after Thessalus and would locate themselves as methodics. So would say, I am a methodikos, as opposed to just attacking them. And those people set up a kind of lineage which goes from, actually starts with Asclepiades of Bithynia, who came to Rome in the end of the 2nd century BC, then goes to Themerson of Laodicea, who started the method but didn't quite get it right, and then Thessalus completed it, and then there's a sequence that follows on from that. So whether or not Thessalus was as rude about all of his predecessors as is alleged is a bit uncertain. But whatever, he is certainly building this system. The method was based around a very simple division between diseases, which were characterized as being of constriction, of fluidity and mixture. Those are the commonalities. And they themselves indicate their cure. So if the disease is a disease of constriction, then you relax it. If it's a disease of fluidity, then you constrict it. And the cause of the disease is irrelevant to the cure. And indeed, the individual constitution of the patient only becomes relevant when you're thinking about the precise details of the cure, how sort of harsh or whatever. It's not instrumental in thinking about the cure itself. That is indicated by the disease. All of these points had quite detailed theoretical underpinnings. And I should also say that the irrelevance of the cause of the disease to the cure doesn't mean they weren't interested. If you read works of surviving methodic writers, most famously Soranus of Ephesus, then you will see that they do put the cause. That's just not what they base their cure on. And that doesn't in itself inform therapy. And thinking about this system, which is a kind of quite pared down system, for example, Vivian Nutten has argued that the method is moved to simplify and regularize a medical system that in various other manifestations is really based very strongly on the almost infinite possibilities of parent variation, where you have to know all about your individual patient's constitution and their kind of life history and exactly what's happened to them in order to be able to determine their susceptibility to illness, identify the illness, come up with a cure, and so on. And that individual medicine is clearly impractical on a large scale. That is a very kind of elite sort of individual medicine. And so Vivian Nutten argues that Methodism is a very rational response to the sheer size of the city of Rome, that it's about a response to a particular kind of social context. So however you think about it, Thessalus represents a kind of pivotal moment in the history of medicine in the Roman Empire, therefore, and at least on a descriptive level, it's a Neronian moment, descriptive in the sense that it happened in the reign of Nero, nor is he the only significant medical figure who worked in Nero's Rome. And I want to take a further look at some of the other figures and ask what we should make of the timing. Did the emperor have anything to do with it? So is it more than descriptively a Neronian moment? And if so, what? Or is this more about the working through of various more structural and political and cultural developments that really are nothing to do with the individual emperor at instance? So that would be that this is in some sense about the kind of solidification of Rome's position as the medical capital of the Mediterranean as well as the political capital. And this is a position which had previously been held by Alexandria, the sort of center of medical culture in the Hellenistic world. And Alexandria's hold on that position was kind of initially dislodged by the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and the annexation of Egypt as a Roman province, which set up a scenario in which you could then, having dislodged it from its political position, you could then sort of you could build on that in order to make Rome into shift the medical resources from Alexandria to Rome in a more systematic way. And you can see that that's going to take a bit of time, that it's going to take some time for the Roman Empire to settle down, for it to become clear exactly where political power lies, for Rome to become at ease with the idea of various forms of elite medical culture, for the elite to embrace that, for there to be a kind of public intellectual medical discourse, for writings to get heard, for schools to be set up, for students to come. And so you could say all of that, 100 years from Actium seems like a good time. So it could just be that it's timing. We've now got the medical resources in Rome, and it's in proximity to political power and so on, or it could be something more specifically Neronian. Now, it has to be said that Nero himself doesn't seem to have had particular medical interests. We are told by Suetonius that he was ill only 3 times in the whole of his 14-year reign, and on no occasion was it really serious. Suetonius says it never stopped him drinking. And that's his kind of measure of seriousness. Now, Pliny does tell a story about the eques Cossianus, who fell victim to licana, which is a very unpleasant skin disease which often afflicted the face and was therefore felt quite strongly about by members of the Roman elite, and who, on account of their great amicitia, Nero felt he needed to help and did so by calling in a specialist doctor from Egypt who prescribed cantharides, aka Spanish fly, aka a poisonous version of the blister beetle, which indeed did kill him. So you could say Nero's not entirely uninterested in health and medicine. And obviously this is a point at which it's appropriate for members of the Roman elite to know something about medicine, to be kind of medically literate, and to know something about doctors, to be able to engage in a properly kind of socially hierarchically organized discussions with their doctors. And it's also an important part of Roman amicitia that you're interested in the health of your friends and you help them out. You're not really meant to poison them, but Nero maybe got the wrong end of the stick or something, but anyway, so there isn't huge amount of evidence that Nero was particularly interested in health and disease, but obviously he did have much wider cultural interests. This is a time when there's really quite significant development of court culture. People have, in various companions and handbooks, talked about cultural renaissance under Nero, that it's the beginning of the second sophistic as kind of cultural performance, and so on. So maybe we could think of it in those sort of terms. Okay, so a quick look then at some of the well-known medical authorities from Nero's Rome helps provide some direction to the discussion here. Though I'm going to admit up front that dates and location of medical careers is a bit problematic. Precision is very difficult. This is a list which includes people whose careers should have, I would be reasonably confident, did overlap with Nero to some extent, either at the beginning or the end of his reign, and who are most likely, but I wouldn't say certain by any stretch of the imagination, to have been active in Rome. Medical culture is so cosmopolitan by this point that it's actually quite difficult to tell where people are located when they're writing. And I'm focusing really on elite figures here, socially and medically. So those who make an impact on the rich and powerful in Rome on the one hand, but also make an impact on the learned medical tradition in some shape or form. There's lots more going on, obviously, beyond that, all sorts of doctors, midwives, medical practitioners of all sorts that are accumulating in the city itself, but I'm going to skip over them for the time being. Okay, so I've already mentioned Thessalus, and I've also mentioned Crinas and Charmis, both from Marseille. There has to be said that apart from Thessalus, their impact on the learned medical tradition is pretty minimal. There may be a couple of recipes that are linked to their names. Crinas is said by Pliny to have developed an astrological medicine, so he had a kind of a bit of a theory, and he had a particular take on the medical art. And the next 2 names, Manassias and Dionysius, I'm less confident that they're Neronian in date, maybe later, but they are here on this list to do a particular job, which is representing Thessalus' students and followers, which he definitely had. He did found a sect, he did have students, He did have followers. We are going to see the methodic sect flourish from now on, expand. We're going to find papyri in Egypt by the end of the 1st century AD and so on. But names, the lineage is hard to trace in terms of names between Thessalus and Soranus of Ephesus, who is the most famous methodic I was talking about, who is active under Trajan. But there is definitely something happening. So they're there as a sort of placeholder for them. Magnus and Agathenus are members of an alternative lineage, at least in some sense. This is, and obviously these lineages all have good names. We've had the Methodists and now we're having the Pneumatics. They're from the Pneumatic Hieresis, originally founded by a pupil of the Stoic philosopher Posidonius of Rhodes back in the 1st century BC, by a chap called Athenaeus of Attalea, but it seems he never got to Rome. But he came up with a medical system which he was committed to, which declared that both health and disease are caused by the all-pervading pneuma. So that's this kind of Aristotelian idea or whatever of some sort of hot air that becomes embedded into the human physiology and is a key Stoic notion in various ways. So having decided that health and disease is caused by the all-pervading pneuma, it's obvious you then call yourself the pneumaticoi. And the kind of Roman launch of the pneumaticoi seems to have been undertaken by Agathenus of Sparta sometime in the late 1st century AD. I suspect he's mostly Flavian, but he could be under Nero and Magnus. There were a lot of Magnuses and it's difficult to tell them apart, but there is definitely a pneumatic Magnus who comes before Agathenus. So he's more likely to have been Neronian. And I also put them on the list because one of the interesting things is that both of them, in some sense, are referred to as responding quite specifically to the new moves of the Thessalian method, that they're responding, they pick up on methodic ideas, they incorporate that into their medicine. It may be that they also pick up on some of Thessalius's kind of advertising techniques, his self-promotion, that there's a new style of kind of doing medicine, doing learned medicine in Rome that has been launched by them by then. So we do have elite medical system builders at Rome, founding schools, teaching, writing, propagating their ideas under Nero. The names in the second column are a little bit different, and I'm going to return to those who have nailed on connections to Nero. Most famously is Andromachus the Elder, who is addressed in various places as archiatros, so literally chief physician, a Hellenistic term for court physician, which comes into use in the context of the Roman imperial court under Claudius as part of the increased formalization of the court. And the physicians attached to it, who, according to the entirely neutral reporting of Pliny, are paid ridiculously large sums of money for their services. And it would seem that both the title and the stipend kind of develop through the Julio-Claudian period, and it's by Claudius and Nero that it's become formalized. And Andromachus is described as archiatros to Nero. There would have been several, so it's not that this is one, each emperor has one physician. A number of people are court physicians with the stipend and the title, but he is particularly famous for his theriac. And theriac is a multi-ingredient drug which combats all poisons and maybe other ailments as well. It's a kind of universal antidote and sometimes also a universal pick-me-up. It's initially developed, so the stories go, by King Mithridates VI of Pontus. And so Galen says in his treatise on antidotes, Andromachus made some adjustments. He took some things out, he put some things in. Most notably, he added viper flesh to the recipe, which becomes important going forwards. And he also then versified his recipe and dedicated the verses to the Emperor Nero. His verses are very long and flowery. They are so 87 elegiac couplets, about 64 ingredients, and the whole recipe is repeated twice. It's both in Galen on antidotes, and then it's in the pseudo-Galenic treatise on theriac to Piso. And Andromachus's version, so the Mithridatic version sort of still floats about, but sort of in some ways Andromachus's theriac becomes the gold standard theriac. The point of reference, all later pharmacological texts will make some reference to it. It is the most famous theriac ever, and theriac is a big thing through the whole of the antique period, through the Middle Ages, into the early modern period, as the very beautiful theriac jars that you can see in the Wellcome collection, such as I have here, also attest to. His son, Andromachus the Younger, then, we are told, translated this theriac recipe back into prose, and then Democritus composed a simpler poetic version in iambic trimeters. And this is a recipe that is very imperial and very luxurious. I said about 64 ingredients, and they include, for example, just random selection here: Illyrian iris, Syrian balsam, Indian cassia, camel's hay brought by the Arab nomads, Libyan turpentine, Galatian nard, Lemnian earth, Pontic's biconard, cardamom from the Ida, Istrian beaver, and Attic honey. And that's only a handful of the recipes. So these are items that are coming from all over the empire and beyond, and those labels are about saying that this is the best version of whatever it is. The best castoreum, the best beaver bits come from the Istria, or the best honey comes from Attica, or whatever it might be. So it is a very kind of imperial project, if you like. But Andromachus also picks up on the tradition of didactic poetry, clearly, as does Democritus, and quite a lot of his, well, a fair number of his verse is in Galen, who says that one of the good things about meter is it helps you remember your quantities. So you get the right amount of Illyrian irises in your recipes. But also, interestingly, Andromachus himself, so I should also, so this is some, you can find all sorts of theriac jars, but this is the opening stanza of his theriac recipe, which, as you can see, so it's not just that it's got the empire in it, but this is very clearly addressed to the emperor as well. And you can make up your own mind about how good you think or bad you think the poetry is. Interestingly, also, Andromachus was himself addressed, had a medical work broadly construed dedicated to him himself, sort of in turn, if you like. That's the Hippocratic glossary of Erosion, about whom little is known. He's a grammarian, but we do know quite a lot about the tradition of Hippocratic lexicography more generally. It flourished in Hellenistic Alexandria, part of the wider process of formation of the Hippocratic corpus, the bringing together of a set of texts originally anonymous, then attached to the name of Galen, and kind of organized together in a particular sort of way. And indeed, so there was both the canon formation, the formation of the Hippocratic corpus, and the development of a commentary, very rich commentary tradition on it in Hellenistic Alexandria, partly because if you think that by the time of Nero, some of the language is obscure and a bit obsolete, it was already, they thought, a bit obsolete and obscure by the time of the sort of early 3rd century BC. But this also just links with wider trends in Alexandrian scholarship and the beginnings of medical sectarianism more broadly, where one of the things that, if you want to set up a sort of medical grouping, is you state your claim to a particular reading of Hippocrates. Everybody agrees that Hippocrates is a kind of founding father figure, but you can disagree then about your interpretations, and that's one of the kind of good areas of competition for doctors. And Neronian wants to present his lexicon as useful for the educated classes in general, and especially physicians. So he says at the beginning that this is, looking at the works of Hippocrates is of no small benefit to those engaged in paideia in general, and especially physicians, and that's why he wants to produce his glossary. But it's interesting that he thinks that addressing Andromachus, whether Andromachus ever saw this or not, we're not particularly bothered either rhetorically or really or both, will help on both counts, that Andromachus is a physician, but also represents that general paideia part of this equation as well, which I think serves to put the spotlight on Andromachus and his influence quite significantly. And it's worth noting here that he is the first court doctor, the first archiatros who does have a place in the learned medical tradition. There are various names that we can come up with earlier. And if we go all the way back to Octavian and Augustus, then Octavian's physician Artorius pops up in some of the learned medical tradition. He was a follower of Asclepiades, and Antonius Musa has the odd recipe. But some of the really big names, for example, Stertinius Xenophon, who is very famous and is all over the epigraphic record of Kos and various other places, and everybody knows that he was physician to Claudius. If you read medical texts, not a mention. He just completely different kind of milieu, whereas Andromachus is all over. You can't read any pharmacological text without meeting Andromachus. And one of the questions obviously is, presumably Nero played some role in him becoming archiatros, but also him becoming archiatros helps then develop his authority. So chicken, egg, I don't know, but certainly this is something where we are talking about imperial influence of some sort. And the other point to notice here in terms of what Neronian is doing and his focus on Andromachus and his importance is that if Rome is even a kind of rhetorical center of Hippocratic scholarship, then they really have made it as the kind of center, capital of medical culture by this point. If they can do that, they can play Alexandria at the Alexandrian game, then it's clear where the winners are here. And that's the kind of point that I want to come back to in conclusion. So my basic point is that as well as being full of more and more medical practitioners of all sorts, so the number of medical practitioners and the range, your ear specialists, your eye specialists, all of those things are arriving and practicing in Rome through the whole of the first century AD. Nero's Rome is also home to, if you like, this kind of sectarian elite of medical practitioners, particularly significant amongst the movers and shakers, the development of the methodikoi, this super successful grouping at the time of Nero, most popular school, and it's also one that has a massive impact on people like the Primiatikoi. Medicine is not going to be the same again in any of it, and even Galen has to dedicate millions of words to. I mean, he dedicates millions of words to lots of things, but he dedicates millions of words to the methodikoi. But it's also clearly important that this is located in Rome itself, in the metropolis, in the imperial capital, and that in some sense, a lot of these are responses to the particularities of the Roman imperial situation. And we might also wonder about the connections between a certain sort of cultural performance and display and self-promotion, which the doctors have been doing for a while. Asclepiades did it, but it does look like Thessalus took it to a new level. Is that something that other people are doing in the Neronian situation? So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that we have clearly in Rome, we have this expert elite also. So people who are not part of a particular sect, but are the best at drugs or the best at Theriac or whatever it might be, who are writing, promoting their ideas, getting their name out there, but not founding schools or necessarily having entire kind of coherent theoretical systems, who find, at least in Andromachus for this moment, a place at the imperial court. And as I said, how significant Nero is in picking him we might think about, but also making the most of empire in this context, particularly in the pharmacological context, particularly in the context of Theriac, the availability of all these items to put into drugs, taking advantage of the wealth that's there, exploiting and adding to the cultural capital of the metropolis. And Andromachus is the kind of figure who, of all of these, even looking forwards, I would say, we would have to get probably to Galen to see a figure who makes a significant impact. There is Crito, who is one of the physicians of Trajan, does make his mark, but even his, I don't think is quite so significant as, and is more probably socially successful. But so I would say wider development is certainly important. This is a process that's working through. Structures are certainly crucial, but Nero helped. And I don't think I would call it a golden age, but I certainly think it's a pivotal moment. And I want to just finish by expressing my regret, I guess, that I'm not able to visit the Nero exhibition, which is sponsored by one of the most environmentally destructive companies active in the world today. I'll show you some nice images of people who took the Nero and BP parallels reasonably seriously earlier. And I would recommend that looking at the BP or not BP website. This is one of the campaigns around particularly BP's sponsorship of cultural institutions, and they have been quite successful in getting cultural institutions to sever their ties. And I hope that the British Museum will follow suit. Thank you very much.
Because time is pressing, we're going to have to move straight on to the next speaker, Dominic Rathbone, a former president from King's College London, who is an expert on papyri as much as political and economic, particularly economic history, and he's going to talk about Nero's secret Egypt. Dominic. It is, as Roland said, a great pleasure to be doing a live event, but since we are a bit pressed for time, I'm going to move straight on. And what I'm talking about is Nero's secret Egypt. And I thought I'd just start by explaining what the image we're using is. And this is an accidental find. In early 2019, they were doing some structural work and they found a room outside in the middle bit of the domus area, which is outside where they expected it. And they haven't excavated it, but they did record these wall paintings. And they just seem to be quite appropriate to this topic. And I am later going to talk about a sphinx. And you see there is a sphinx at the end of the room. You can just about make out it's a sphinx. And what we used were some dolphins and a Capricorn. And I will also come on to dolphins and not a Capricorn, but certainly a fair bit of astrology. And this is my sort of text, as it were, where I got my Nero's secret Egypt. And because there is quite a bit of pseudery around here, what better to illustrate it than a fake bust of Nero as pharaoh, which is in the Louvre. And it comes from AD 64, and Nero sets out after his enormous success at Naples, which brings the theatre down, literally. He sets off to the east via Beneventum, and then he kind of has a bit of a wobble, goes back to Rome, stirring the eastern provinces, especially Egypt, in his secret fantasies. And he's going to go off again when he has, maybe one of the times he's ill, he goes into the Temple of Vesta and he has a fit or a stroke or something and doesn't defer it. And then he does plan to visit Egypt again, following his great successes in Greece, but has to return to Rome and then hopes at the end he might retire there. So he never quite gets to Egypt, but it's in his secret fantasies. Okay, now what I'm going to, there are two aspects to Nero's secret Egypt. One of them is that it's the secret Egypt in the sense that the evidence from Egypt for Nero's reign, which is ignored, which is quite useful. I'll just do a bit of that. And then the other secrets are the interest in the secrets of Egypt in Nero's court.
And I start with a list of the governors of Egypt, the prefects under Nero. There are 4 prefects. They're all close personal or family friends of his, not terribly expected. Tiberius Claudius Balbillus we'll be coming back to. He's probably an Ephesian, but he's a man with very close contacts with the Alexandrian elite, so would have been a great pleasure to them that he was appointed. Then you've got Festinus, Julius Festinus, who's brother of one of Nero's closest mates, a mate so close that Nero, of course, puts him to death. And then there's Caecina Tuscus, allegedly Nero's nurse, who is exiled, it's said by Suetonius, for using the baths he built for Nero's intended visit in 64. That's part of the evidence for his visit. And then lastly, and most extraordinary of all, perhaps in some ways, Tiberius Julius Alexander, of one of the most prominent Jewish families of Alexandria, the nephew of the great philosopher Philo, and the man who puts down the Jewish revolt in Alexandria with no compunction, and later becomes a great supporter of the Flavians. And we know, and also he issues his famous, if you study Roman Egypt, for issuing a great long edict on the 6th of July, AD 68, in honor of Galba, promising to rectify all the abuses of Roman government in Egypt. And when you look at the dates and when you look at the language, it's fairly clear this was written and prepared for Nero's visit, and then he has to slightly cross out Nero and put in Galba when he issues his edict. Okay, we do know a bit about Nero and Egypt. Here we have a letter from early in his reign from the city of Ptolemais Euergetes in the Fayum. They sent an embassy to offer Nero a temple and a golden crown, and correctly, following the example of his father Claudius, or his adoptive father, and of Tiberius, he refuses both of these as being inappropriate. And this is the young Nero. And it's very like Claudius's letter to the Alexandrians, which you have of AD 41. And just to remind you, in Alexandria, when Claudius came to the throne, it was as though the civil war had been reversed, because Claudius was the grandson of Mark Antony. He was only distantly related to Augustus through his sister. And it's suddenly, under Claudius, all the Alexandrians, elite Alexandrians, get Roman citizenship. They're all called Tiberius Claudius and so on. And Alexandria does get a lot. Suddenly it's standing in the Roman world, improves no end. And that continues under Nero. One other thing Nero does in Egypt, there are various administrative changes and so on. I'm not going to go through these, but just to show how this reflects what's going on in Rome. 2 coins of his. Under the Romans, initially, they essentially used the Ptolemaic silver coinage. The main coin in Egypt is a silver tetradrachm 4 drachma coin, and they're technically the coins of Alexandria, not of Egypt. And what happens is they go on using them with a bit of minting under Claudius and Nero, and there's an early example from his reign. On the front, Nero looking quite young, and on the back, the Demos Romaion, the Populus Romanus. This is the young kind of Nero following the example of Augustus. Suddenly, by 63 to 4, you've got the very different face, the fatter, fuller face that we know from Roman iconography, a radiate crown, almost certainly signifying regal, if not divine status. And on the back, Poppaea, and now called Sebaste, Augusta. She is herself Augusta, the title she was given in Rome on the death of her daughter Claudia. And she is now portrayed, and they are portrayed essentially as Ptolemaic king and queen. And that is what this change, and it's reflecting what happens at Rome as well. Also, what he does in 64, suddenly all the old coinage disappears, it's all minted down, and masses of new tetradrachms are minted throughout the rest of his reign. So the coins with the head of Nero are the main coinage of Egypt through to almost the Severan period. Okay, much the same as at Rome. Lastly, in Egypt, we know about imperial estates. There are imperial estates in all the provinces. We just know about them better in Egypt. And it's interesting to see from those that are recorded, who owns them. Nero is attested as owner of a couple of them. Agrippina owns no end of imperial properties, obviously going back to Claudius, but it is true she does control, that's part of the story. She's allowed to control the imperial wealth. And then you find Claudius's daughter, Antonia, has some. Claudia Acte owns quite a lot. That's the nurse who is Nero's mistress throughout his life and married him. Calvia Crispinilla, his last mistress. Pallas, a lot of estates going on from Claudius. And then Doryphorus. Doryphorus is Nero's favorite. He gets all Narcissus's estates, and it's interesting how it happens. And then Seneca, of course, Seneca has no end of estates. He gets more than almost anyone else, which shows how, how he is rewarded by Nero. It explains a lot of his wealth. Okay, so that's sort of Nero and Egypt. And now I want to talk about links and Nero's court and Egypt. And I'm going to start with none other than Seneca. Now, Seneca, in the consolation he writes to his mother at one stage, does say a bit about his past and claims he spent 10 years in Egypt with his aunt, his mother's stepsister, when her husband was prefect. And this is traditionally thought to be Gaius Galerius, who's prefect from 21 to 26, so it's 7 years, not 10, but and so, it does appear that Seneca maybe did spend some part of his youth when he was ill convalescing in Alexandria, and presumably will have built up various links, personal links, friendships with members of the Alexandrian elite and so on. Then we also happen to know that, that he has links through his estates, these estates that are given to him. And he talks in one letter in his retirement of how now he is no longer interested in wealth. And when the grain fleet from Alexandria comes in, preceded by its fast mail packets, he doesn't rush down to the shore to get letters from me, my people, to see how his estates are doing. And from some papyri, we know who these are. He has a Misthotes, a chief lessee of his estates, who's called Tiberius Claudius Theon, and is one of the leading families of Alexandria. So Seneca has very close family and personal links with Egypt. And he has an interest in Egypt. In his Questions of Nature, he talks about the origin of the Nile. Indeed, he says, I myself spoke to 2 centurions, whom Nero Caesar, a keen lover of all virtues and above all knowledge, had sent to investigate the source of the Nile. And the Roman elite of the time, this is what we're going to see now, are particularly interested in natural curiosities. It's almost like a precursor of the late 16th, early century cabinets of curiosities. They're quite indiscriminate between things that are scientifically correct and things that are utter fantasy or fake. I mean, everything is of interest, okay? And the great example of that surviving written example is the Pliny the Elder and his natural history. But we also know that the Flavian general Licinius Mutianus, for example, wrote a work about marvels of nature and so on. So this is a very common interest. And Nero and his court are very active in this. And Nero clearly does sponsor some military expedition into Ethiopia, possibly with a view to conquest as well. There is, when Tiridates comes to Rome, there's an all-Ethiopian gladiatorial show that's put on. And part of this is a genuine interest in the source of the Nile, or as the Romans come to realize, the sources of the Nile. And this turns up in his Naturalis Quaestiones. In book 4 is on the Nile in general, and book 6 is about sources. And this is recycled by his nephew Lucan in Lucan's poem, The Civil War, where he takes the opportunity of Caesar being at a banquet hosted by Cleopatra to have Caesar question a linen-wearing man called Achoraeus. He's holy and so on. He is clearly meant to be an Egyptian priest. And he says to Achoraeus what he wants to know: expound the first beginnings of the nation of the Pharos, the topography of its land, the customs of its people, and the cult of forms of its gods. Reveal what is sculpted in your ancient sanctums and disclose your gods who are willing to be known. And above all, tell me about the inundation and where the Nile comes from. And unfortunately, what you get then in Lucan is you don't get an explanation of Egyptian religion. All you get is an explanation of the Nile and its origin. But note that with this interest in the topography, the origin of the Nile, there's a broader interest in the topography of Egypt, the history of Egypt, its priesthood, its religion, and so on. Okay, and note too that Akoreos also says that now it is this age where for the first time the gods have allowed us to reveal the secrets of our religion and our knowledge. This is new. Okay. This is picked up in Servius's commentary on 4th century commentary on the Aeneid, where he too cites Lucan and claims that Seneca wrote a work on the topography and religion of Egypt. It seems, I'm not a great expert on Seneca, that this is not generally thought to be one of his genuine works, and it may be a conflation of some of his geographical writings and works of someone else, perhaps called Kairimon, more in a moment. And note here the interest in Isis. And we note this is one of the things that's going on at the time. Nero too, the temple of Isis at Philo is extensively rebuilt under Nero, possibly with his patronage. I move on now to someone completely different, who certainly is involved in what we've been talking about, this character called Kairimon, who must have known Seneca, whether they were friends or rivals. And he's a multicultural, multi-talented phenomenon in himself. The various records about who he was and what he did mix all kinds of things. He's allegedly a tutor, a didaskalos of Nero. He's head of the museum at Alexandria under Nero. He described himself as the Stoic. He's described twice as a hierogrammatus, a sacred scribe, maybe meaning a hieroglyph writer. And he wrote works which ranged from Greek grammar, a study of conjunctions. He wrote a history of Egypt, including an account of Moses and the origins of astrology, where he claimed that he decided that Babylonian astrology was older than Egyptian, which he was right, but that Egyptian astrology is independent, on which he's wrong. It is now thought to be a development from Babylonian. He wrote a treatise on hieroglyphs, and he wrote an allegorical interpretation of Egyptian myths and so on. So he's interested in astrology, and he basically, what he did was he presented Egyptian religion as in Stoic terms, and his view was that essentially there's a physical cosmos and everything has physical explanations, but that the system Egyptian gods are a terribly clever allegorical explanation of all this. And so therefore that's what he's doing. I just want to say a bit of this. We do know quite a bit about what he wrote because there are several passages that are quoted in later writers. And this is one of the most extensive, which is quoted by the Neoplatonist Porphyry on abstinence. It says, Kairimon the Stoic, in his account of the practices of the Egyptian priests, whom he says are the Egyptian equivalent of philosophers, explains that they chose their temples as places to philosophize and so on. And says they were safe there because everyone honored them as if they were sacred animals. They were on their own, for contact only occurred at the general fairs and festivals, whereas for the rest of the time, the temples were almost inaccessible to other people because to approach them required purification and abstinence. And yes, it shows here that they have to omit sacred animals. Kairimon deals with the sacred animals, but tries to avoid those on the whole. The priests are presented as philosophers. Otherwise, it's correct. Yes, temples are open for festivals. That's when the people come in. Otherwise, they are closed. There's ritual purity. And the second quote is also correct. They divided the night for observation of the heavenly bodies, and during the day, the cult of the gods, during which 3 or 4 times they sang hymns in the morning and the evening. And otherwise, they embarked on a research program with impact, mathematical and geometric problems. The real philosophizing, he then says, was done by the prophetai, hierostolistai, and hierogrammates, and also the horologoi. The remaining matter, the priests and pastophoroi and the okoroi, purify themselves, but with less accuracy and self-control. And all this is absolutely correct. It matches exactly the organization of the priests, their titles, as we find them in the papyri of the Ptolemaic and Roman period. And it's fairly clear that Kairimon was probably, almost certainly he is an Egyptian priest, very high-ranking Egyptian priest, who is also Hellenized and operates probably under two names in two languages and so on. And he is the first to expound Egyptian religion systematically to the Greek-speaking world, essentially. And so he is, in a sense, the Achareos of Lucan. And this is fitting into a general interest of the time. In Pompeii, there is the Temple of Isis with its famous frescoes of Isaic rituals, which you couldn't have seen unless you were a member of the temple, because they're all inside. And of course, and it's Kairimon's writing on the priest that is very much behind Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris, which claims to use all kinds of other sources, many of them clearly fake, that seems to be essentially based on Seneca and Kairimon. And the irony of this is that until recently, most Egyptological books on Egyptian religion use Plutarch as its main source for the behavior of Egyptian priests. In other words, they're drawing on Kairimon's view of Egyptian priests in the 1st century AD to explain priests of the Old Kingdom, which wasn't really very good. And people are now changing that slightly. Right, moving on, the general women at Nero's court may have been particularly responsible for some of these Orientalist and astrological interests, such as Poppaea Sabina, Nero's wife, from AD 62 to 66, whose family came from Pompeii, or at least had branches in Pompeii. She herself is attested as a landowner there. And she may have known the Temple of Isis there. There wasn't a Temple of Isis in Rome in her day. That comes with Vespasian. And she figures a couple of times in Josephus's Jewish Antiquities. Once earlier on in his reign, we're told Nero frees 10 Jewish priests who have been sent to him on trial as a favor to his wife Poppaea, who interceded for them because she was a God-fearer, a Theosebes. And in some books, this has been led to theories that she was a convert to Judaism or even a Christian, but this is extremely unlikely, as we'll see from other reasons. Her other reference, which is not so, is that we're told that Gessius Florus, the procurator who is allegedly responsible for the Jewish revolt, gets the job through his wife Cleopatra, as she was a friend of Poppaea, Nero's wife, and who was no less evil than him. Now, Cleopatra is obviously a name with Egyptian resonance, and she may well be the Cleopatra who's a concubine of Claudius, who informs on Messalina, because it was Messalina who caused the suicide of Poppaea's mother. So that would explain the friendship. Cleopatra is, amongst the Jewish community of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Ptolemaeus were very common names. The Ptolemies had actually favored the Jews, and they used these often. They'd have a Jewish name and they'd use Cleopatra or Ptolemaeus as their other name. And it is, I think, conceivable that therefore Poppaea's links are with the Alexandrian Jewish community and other, not exclusively them, and that Gessius Florus bizarrely may have been appointed because he was supposedly sympathetic to the Jews, although that didn't quite work out, just like Tiberius Julius Alexander is made prefect of Egypt and then puts down the Jewish revolt there. Other things we know about Poppaea. Poppaea's backstairs, her secreta, that word again, hosted many astrologers, says Tacitus, the worst equipment for imperial marriage. One of them, Ptolemaeus, on Otho's staff in Spain, had promised that Otho would survive Nero and afterwards, trusted because this happened, persuaded he would soon be advanced to emperor. So that's when Poppaea is married to Otho. She has an astrologer, or they have an astrologer called Ptolemaeus, almost certainly in Alexandria. And in the poems of the Greek anthology, there are several by a guy called Leonidas of Alexandria, a poet and astrologer, and one mostly of Neronian date, one of them addressed to Poppaea. Poppaea Augusta, spouse of Zeus, receive from Nile-born Leonidas this representation of the heavens at the hour of your birth. For you take pleasure in gifts worthy of your marriage bed and wisdom. And it's generally assumed that what this accompanies is a chart of her horoscope, or possibly even a globe representing the planets at her at her birth. And presumably he got his prediction wrong, because he wasn't going to say you're going to die soon. No doubt. And lastly, our last indication of Poppia's interest in Egypt and links is that although there is some sort of funeral at which Nero burns an extraordinary quantity of spices, her body, says Tacitus, was not destroyed by fire as is Roman custom, but following the practice of foreign kings, was preserved by being packed with aromatics and placed in the tumulus iuliorum. A public funeral, however, was held. And that's quite interesting, because mummification was not something you can really do it yourself in your kitchen. You know, there must have been at Rome, and they must have had access to people who really knew what they were up to with that. Lastly, I come back to Balbillus, Nero's first prefect of Egypt. And there is some controversy of the various people called Balbillus who do various things, whether they're all one man or a number of different men, but I think they're all the same man. Essentially, this is, and this is an inscription from Ephesus in Latin, honoring, putting up a statue to him, apparently when he is prefect of Egypt. And people have been very puzzled by this titulature of the temples of the divine Augustus and all the groves and so on, and the museum, and in charge of the temple complex. And I think this is just telling us what this bloke's like, rather than just have a normal inscription saying Praefecto Aegypti. He gives all the roles he does, the antiquarian, religious, and things like that, which a prefect does. But this is what interests him. It's not just being prefect of Egypt. And going back earlier, he's been a procurator in Asia. He's an old friend of Claudius. He's with Claudius for the invasion of Britain, along with Sclatinius Xenophon, who's been mentioned before. And so he's an old friend of Claudius. And he turns up in AD 41 on the Alexandrian embassy as a guest speaker. And for this reason, many people have thought he's Alexandrian. He's not. He's Ephesian, but he's got links there. The other thing is that it's been suggested that the inscription be restored to make him son of Thrasyllus, the astrologer of Tiberius. And although proof is lacking, there's a sort of wigwam argument that fits this. Agrippina, he's also a particular friend of Agrippina. Agrippina has very close links with Ephesus and Asia in general, not surprising. And it's as her amicus, apparently, that Nero makes him prefect. It's to show that she still has honor. And we're told that one of the reasons why he's her amicus is because it would fit if he is the Chaldeus, the son of Thrasyllus, whom she consults in AD 37 when Nero is born, and he predicts Nero will be emperor and will kill his mother. And the Balbillus, it's almost certainly this prefect, then he is quite good. He does astrology for Nero. In AD 64, he says, don't worry about that comet, you're not going to die. And he does it for Vespasian as well, saying you're going to be emperor. And so he is a great survivor. And in the end, the Ephesians set up a festival to him called the Balbilea. Now, here we come to his interests, and this is where the dolphins come in, and there are those dolphins. Seneca, in his Questions of Nature, Balbillus, a fine man, and unusually expert in scholarly pursuits, in other words, a scholar and a gentleman, is my source for the spectacle he saw during his tenure of Egypt as prefect at the Heracleotic mouth of the Nile, of a sort of pitched battle between the dolphins swimming in from the sea and the crocodiles swimming out from them and forming a column against them. And the crocodiles are defeated by the dolphins, who go under them and then spike them with their dorsal spikes in their soft underbellies, which Balbillus had personally seen, perhaps put down in his Miracles and confirmed to Seneca, which shows that not only was he a scholar and a gentleman, but he also had a very vivid imagination. Lastly, I come to an inscription from, and here's our Sphinx, from near the Sphinx. And it's put up under Nero. His name is being chiseled out after him in honor of Tiberius Claudius Balbillus. Nero is the good genius, the agathos daimon of the world, who along with all these other benefactions has sent Balbillus. And through the favors and benefactions of this man, Egypt is brimming with every good and the Nile is flooding. and so on. And so the men of Buzaris, and that's the village of Giza, essentially, and the other people from the area, the officials, honor him, and they decide to honor him, and they put up an inscription near the pyramid. By the way, this inscription was found in 1816 at Giza by a French captain, Cavilla, and somehow mysterious circumstances was acquired by the Englishes in the British Museum, and bizarrely is not in the Nero exhibition. You'd have thought they might have put it in. And there it is. It's not the world's best inscription. You can see the locals weren't really up to Greek epigraphy very much. And they have decided to vote a decree and to erect a stone stele in the precinct of the great god Helios Harmakis, showing from the inscribed record of good things the benefactions attributable to him, and so on and so on. And they are going to honor his godlike favors, his isotheoi karitai, inscribed in hieroglyphs in sacred writing. And for when he visited the nome and did obeisance to Helios Harmakis, was delighted by the greatness and impressiveness of the pyramids, and saw that with a large quantity of sand through the center. Yeah, it always happens, doesn't it, with inscription. Right. Okay, Helios Harmakis. That's what the Sphinx really is. It's Hor, the rising sun, the rising sun. So that's what it's not a female Sphinx. It's a male Sphinx. It's the sun god. And note the fact that Balbillus his benefactions are claimed to be godlike. That's really quite striking. That's normally only done of emperors in the Principate. You don't normally say that of governors. He doesn't get his hieroglyphs, or if he did, they're lost. The Greek is pretty crummy too. And what did he do? Possibly he cleared the sand off the Sphinx, which does very regularly sand up. Okay, now here's a little picture of the Sphinx there. And this is a drawing done by Latron in 1848, which shows us where the Balbillus inscription was found. It's down on the left half corner. The Sphinx, the Sphinx had these pores built, extended in the Ptolemaic period. Those part of one pore is in the Louvre. And in between the pores, there's a chapel of Thutmosis IV. And then in the Roman period, 2 sets of stairs leading to viewing and worshipping precincts are built. And the higher one of those is dated by an inscription to the time of Septimius Severus and his visit. And the lower one is where the Balbillus inscription is, or the platform, and maybe is of that date. Now, if Balbillus's people there, priests, knew he'd cleared this, and if they did know hieroglyphs and so on, what they'll have known that in the chapel of Thutmosis, the stele taught how Thutmosis, who was a young son of Amenophis, Thutmosis, the grandfather of Akhenaten, he wasn't due to be pharaoh. And one day he was out in the desert hunting, and he felt a bit tired. So he stopped to shelter under the head of the Sphinx, which was all that could be seen. And while he was there, he had a dream. And in the dream, Harmakis said, if you clear the sand from my Sphinx, then I will make you pharaoh. And so he did, and he did become pharaoh. Now, did Balbillus know that if he cleared that, well, so last we come to the Colossi of Memnon, and in November 130, Hadrian and Sabina are there, and they and their entourage deface the Colossi with numerous bad inscriptions and verses. But one of them is written by a woman called Julia Balbilla, and she refers to her grandparents, one of whom is King Antiochus of Commagene, and the other is Balbillus the Sophos, through whom she has, and she refers to her mother as being royal, and there's reason to think her mother is someone called Claudia Capitolina, who is linked to a Hellenistic, marries into a Hellenistic dynasty. So, well, Balbillus did get one thing right. Harmakis didn't make him king, but he did give royal status to his daughter and granddaughter. Thank you.
And our next speaker is Siobhan Chomse from Royal Holloway, who is going to speak about Fool's Gold, Nero and Dido's Lost Treasure. That fantastic story. So please.
So hello in here, and hello out there as well. I'll just shift you over a bit. I hope you don't mind, because I'm going to look at my notes on my laptop. So this talk is in part, I suppose, about the perils of dodgy digging, which is something that perhaps the British Museum, as Rebecca suggested, might do well to think on, given their alliance with BP. But I'll get on with my talk. So in the very first chapters of the very last book of Tacitus's Annals as they survive, the historian tells the curious tale of Nero's search for Dido's buried treasure. So this is 65 CE. Agrippina is long since dead, so too Burrus, and Seneca has recently signed off with a flourish in the wake of the Pisonian conspiracy, which ended in failure and a blue bloodbath that must have drained Nero's court of some of its colour. But understudies were waiting in the wings, and as the aftermath of the conspiracy keeps bleeding on into book 16, the dissipation and excess of Nero and the sycophancy and indulgence of his court reach a frenzied pitch as the reader begins to look towards the end we know is coming, but won't see with Tacitus, the emperor's offstage death in 68. In 65, at the beginning of book 16, we find Nero a little strapped for cash. The fire of 64 had been an expensive business, with not just the Domus Aurea to splurge on, but the less fun and less easily condemned recovery and rebuilding efforts to fund. According to Tacitus, Nero had ransacked Italy and the provinces, emptied allied coffers and stripped temples of their statues, but still found himself a little short. So when a certain Caecilius Bassus fought his way into court with a get-rich-quick scheme of epic proportions, the emperor was all ears. Bassus, Tacitus tells us, although the story also appears briefly in Suetonius, well, he had had a dream. So confident was Bassus in the veracity of what the dream had shown him that he hot-footed it to Rome, bought himself an audience with the emperor, and revealed that on his own land a vast cave had been discovered, which contained a great store of gold, lying about in massive ingots and towering columns. Bassus mentioned that his personal theory was that this was none other than the legendary buried treasure of Queen Dido, who, on escaping Tyre and founding Carthage, had hidden the gold for fear her people would be spoilt by their excessive wealth, or that the hostile Numidian kings would be inflamed by their desire for gold to go to war with the new city. Bassus was convinced, moreover, that this gold had lain hidden for such a very long time for the express purpose of increasing the prosperity of the present age. Nero was on board. It was a gift ready for taking. Pausing to check the credentials of neither the story nor its teller, he actually exaggerated the tale himself. Tacitus says that he auget rumorem, and sent off a team post haste to retrieve the treasure, assuming it was just lying ready in wait. The treasure hunt happened to occur just as the quinquennial games were taking place for the second time, and orators fell over themselves to take it up as their prime material for praise of the emperor, waxing lyrical about what amounted to a new golden age of miraculous fruitfulness and gifts from the gods. With the promised treasure burning a hole in his pocket, Nero's extravagance swelled to new proportions, with the prodigious spending of non-existent funds that plunged the state into poverty. Meanwhile, declaring at every moment that this was the spot to the army of soldiers and locals that accompanied him, Bassus had dug up his entire estate to no avail. Finally, rid of his derangement and baffled by his false dream, he swore that this had never happened before. Bassus escaped humiliation and dread by committing suicide. Alternatively, as Tacitus also allows, Bassus was arrested and later released, having been stripped of his property in lieu of the treasure. To Syme, this episode was a light interlude in Tacitus's annals, but more recent analysis has explored its complex construction and intertextual fabric to reveal hidden depths. I've spent quite a bit of time recounting Tacitus's tale, not only for context, but because, as Syme suggests, it's quite fun and it bears repeating, although there is some irony in that statement given what I'm about to argue. My research focuses on the idea of the sublime, that complex and profoundly mixed of emotions, a blend of delight and horror produced in response to the experience of something that transcends and overwhelms our powers of comprehension. For a person who is interested in the sublime, Tacitus's account of Nero's treasure hunt might seem to set a few bells ringing. As we'll see, its marvelous proportions are on the sublime scale. In the very simplest of terms, the sublime is connected with an impression of the infinite, glimpsed in the experience of something, be that an object, a text, an idea, or so on, that pushes us to the limits of our understanding, and in so doing, challenges the mind to recognize the existence of the boundless beyond. We might feel this in contemplation of a vast cavern, its depth too massive to fathom, or in imagining a secret mass of gold, its origins glamorous and obscure, its value incalculable. Tacitus's story of Nero's quest for Dido's treasure bears some of the trappings of sublimity in the scale of the adventure and its component parts, and in the epic texture of its patchwork fabric. But in this story, sublimity rings almost literally hollow, and I'll argue that Tacitus treats it quite deliberately as an example of the false sublime. I'll begin by trying to measure the scale of the prospect that Bassus offers to Nero and the scale of the response of emperor and court. Tacitus's account of Bassus's dream is lavish in its attention to the language of scale, emphasized, as Rhiannon Ash has noted, with various verbal tricks. The cave is of an immense depth, immensa altitudine, containing a great quantity of gold, magna vis auri, in really weighty ingots, lateres praegravis, and standing in columns, ad stantibus columnis, that give us a sense of vertical stretch matched in the expanse suggested by the masses of gold distributed about the cave's floor. So the treasure is of massive dimensions, but also great antiquity, and having lain hidden, occulta, for so very long, per tantum aevi, is endowed with its own powers of expansion, augendis praesentibus bonis. Tacitus's Bassus is talking the language of the sublime here, and it seems to infect the emperor. Puffed up with the prospect of this massive windfall, which is destined to augment the good fortune of his own age, augendis, Nero continues to expand, not only augmenting the rumor, auget rumorem, but allowing his own extravagance to swell, gliscebat luxuria, on the empty promise spe inani of the treasure. The original expanding emperor is, of course, Augustus, whose sublime name, from the verb augeo, meaning to increase, grow, raise, or exalt, and so on, offered an ever-increasing potential that is famously played with by Ovid, for example, in the Fasti. Augustus played an important part in the way Nero conceived of and promoted his rule as a kind of second coming of the Augustan Golden Age. So Tacitus taps into that ideological fantasy here. As Philip Hardy points out, though, this is not a Roman Golden Age, but a Carthaginian one, based on a fantasy of fruitfulness from out of the soil, not of Italy, but of Africa, and thus productive of a new fecundity, nova fecunditate, that is perhaps better translated as strange. Of course, Tacitus warns us not to take this Golden Age fantasy seriously, as he punctures the swollen dimensions of the tale and the public response with a characteristically sharp comment. This is no more than a work of fiction. They were making it up, he tells us, fingebant, eloquent and sycophantic in the highest degree. While there are some sensible people, the prudentes, the character of the age, following the emperor's lead, is credulous, and gossip, fama, is the order of the day. It seems clear then that although this is an adventure on a sublime scale, this cannot be true sublimity. So how are we to tell when what seems sublime is not? Fortunately, Pseudo-Longinus, who I'll just call Longinus for simplicity's sake, in his Perihypsus on the sublime, diligently warns the reader against the temptations of the false sublime, and in so doing, offers us a useful definition. At the beginning of his treatise, Longinus sets out a series of features of which to be wary in the judgment of verse and prose. I won't dwell on those features here, but they amount essentially to grandiose form not justified by inferior content, and on these grounds alone, Bassus's extravagant tall story does not fit the sublime bill. In chapter 7, Longinus offers some concluding remarks on the false sublime. It's a long-ish passage, but it's quite an important one for what we're going to say, so I'll just move through it fairly quickly here. He begins chapter 7 as follows: "We must realize, dear friend, that as in our everyday life, nothing is really great which it is a mark of greatness to despise. I mean, for instance, wealth, position, reputation, sovereignty, and all the other things which possess a very grand exterior." He continues, "So it is with the lofty style in poetry and prose. We must consider whether some of these passages have merely some outward show of grandeur, which with a rich layer of casual accretions, and whether, if all this is peeled off, they may not turn out to be empty bombast, which it is more noble to despise than to admire. Flashy verse and prose then, like the trappings of wealth and power, when stripped bare, reveal a moral vacancy, and so should be despised, not admired. So we should be wary of Bassus's bombastic tale, laced, as we'll see, with epic allusions, and the gold that Nero seeks for the gratification of his own luxuria, in spite of its sublime volume, setting, and ancient pedigree, cannot be sublime." Longinus goes on. "For the true sublime naturally elevates us, uplifted with a sense of proud exultation, we're filled with joy and pride, as if we had ourselves produced the very thing we heard. If then a man of sense, well versed in literature, after hearing a passage several times, finds it does not affect him with a sense of sublimity, and does not leave behind in his mind more food for thought than the words at first suggest, but rather that on consideration it sinks into the pathetic, then it cannot really be the true sublime, if its effect does not outlast the moment of utterance. The true sublime affects the reader or listener so strongly with a sense of elevating joy and delight that we feel as if we ourselves were its author. This is only possible, though, for one capable of exercising independent critical judgment. So if a sensible, educated person, after repeated encounters with the passage, is left cold, then it does not make the cut. More on this shortly. And the chapter concludes as follows. For what is truly great bears repeated consideration. It is difficult, nay, impossible to resist its effect, and the memory of it is stubborn and indelible. To speak generally, you should consider that to be beautifully and truly sublime, you should consider that to be beautifully and truly sublime, which pleases all people at all times. So true sublimity bears repeating, not only in the moment, but most importantly across time. It is transcendent and, as Longinus here implies, universal, on the condition, as we saw a moment ago, that this universal community is educated and sensible. Of course, while Nero was a self-identified literateur, he has not gone down in Tacitus's historical record as a particularly sensible man. The Greek adjective Longinus uses to describe this man of sense is emphonon, meaning rational or intelligent, sensible or prudent, precisely the qualities that Nero lacks in Tacitus's account, where he's identified at the very start of the story, and thus the very start of the book, as the plaything of fortune, driven into folly by his own silliness, vanitatem, and credulity, promissa caeceli bassi, so Bassus's empty promises. Bassus's story of Dido's buried treasure seems deliberately composed to appeal to Nero's literary pretensions, and in doing so, to show up his lack of sense. If we follow Longinus's definition of a truly sublime work as one that bears repetition, endures in the mind, and transcends the barriers of time and space, then Virgil's Aeneid is it. In Bassus's story of the buried treasure, though, so mangled is Virgil's text by both author and reader, or perhaps I better make that plural, authors and readers, that its sublime qualities are rendered false. In the age of Nero, no one possesses the sense to experience the true sublime. Bassus's tale is stitched together from a series of allusions to the first book of Virgil's epic. Tacitus's engagement with the Aeneid in this episode has been well documented in recent analyses by, for example, Philip Hardy and Vicky Reimel, but it's worth considering a few of the allusions here, since the story plays fast and loose with character identity with some intriguing implications. In Book 1 of the Aeneid, we learn that Dido was visited in a dream by her murdered husband, Sichaeus, who tells her to leave Tyre and reveals a vast hidden treasure trove of long buried silver and gold. Bassus turns this dream upside down, casting himself as a sort of Dido. Both are troubled in their minds, both dreaming of buried treasure, both voyaging abroad by sea, the one already in possession of her riches, the other yet to uncover them. But as Bassus describes Dido, he bungles his references, naming her as an exile, profugam, and founder, condita Carthaginae, in language inextricably bound in the true literary mind with Virgil's Aeneas. As the leader to whom the dream is revealed, though secondarily in this instance, perhaps Nero would make a better Dido, though his motivations are quite the opposite of the Queen's. While Nero, the decadent fire starter, wants to dig the treasure up, Dido's desire, as we saw earlier, was to bury the treasure for fear of its corrupting and incendiary effects. Bassus is named by Tacitus explicitly as the auctor of the story, the author of the story, and yet Nero also plays a part in its composition as it slips into rumor thanks to the emperor's augmentative effect, and then, to quote Riemel, takes flight as Pharma, an epic form, as Hardy points out, in diverse reports amongst the great Neronian public, only to be taken up again in fictionalizing efforts by the official orators of the quinquennial games. The text then has multiple authors, but one key reader, Nero, who should know it well. Nero's Trojan obsession plays a prominent part in the annals. In book 12, for example, Tacitus records the teenage Nero's support for the people of Ilium and his disquisition on Rome's Trojan inheritance, Aeneas, and other traditions not too far removed from fable. Most famously, of course, Tacitus includes in book 15 the rumor, there it is again, that while Rome burned in 64, Nero sang on the stage at the fall of Troy, making the devastation of his own city a kind of parody of the destruction of its epic double. Another example of the false sublime, perhaps. Nero's poetic ambitions are well known and much derided in the annals. His literary pretensions and personal obsession with Trojan legend should, in theory, make him the ideal reader of Bassus's story. In fact, Tacitus's Nero is a very poor reader indeed. He tests the reliability, fide spectata, of neither the auctor of the story nor the affair itself, nor does he attempt to seek out the truth of the matter. What Nero displays is desire devoid of either knowledge or curiosity in Tacitus's account. The allusions to the Aeneid in Bassus's story offer the reader repeated exposure to a sublime text. But so garbled are the allusions, so lacking in sense are both its author and its reader, that what emerges is not sublimity but pathos, not the true but the false sublime. Longinus's true sublime exalts the reader so that they feel themselves to be the author of the text that inspires them. Tacitus offers us a parody of this movement that transforms the tale into rumor and then into shifting Pharma, when first Nero steps in to pump things up and his people and court promptly follow suit. In Longinus's treatise, sublimity is linked with morality. True sublimity, he tells us, is the echo of a noble mind. And in that moment of transport that allows us to feel ourselves the author of the sublime, there is a moral elevation too. But true sublimity can be neither authored nor experienced by those who hold in high regard those things which it is a mark of greatness to despise: wealth, position, reputation, sovereignty, and all the other things which possess a very great exterior, as he says in chapter 7. So it follows that, as Robert Doran argues, if hypsos is about high-mindedness for Longinus, then the false sublime is a kind of moral corruption. Perhaps this explains in part then why Tacitus devotes 3 chapters at the start of book 16 to this curious story, not so much a light interlude as a clever condemnation of the moral character of Nero in an age in which sublimity must be false. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Well, I think we must move straight on to our final paper today. Shushma Malik is a senior lecturer at the University of Roehampton and is an expert on imperial Latin literature, and is going to speak to us about the Emperor and his cithara, Nero's musical life and afterlife.
Well, in the interests of wine, shortly, I will try and keep this brief. But I am going to talk to you today about one of the things that Nero is perhaps very, well, if not most famous, very, very well known for, which is his love of music. There are few things, I think, that identify Nero as well as his performative elements and the way that he is enthusiastic and enthused by things that are performative and musical. Music and Nero are perhaps almost inseparable. And it's not only that the emperor enjoys music, but he's also extremely curious about music and musical instruments. So what I want to talk to you about today really is, first of all, a bit of an overview of that curiosity, how he manifests that curiosity. And then, because I'm very interested in historiography, an instance of how Nero's musical life is used by historiographers to perhaps fill a void that would otherwise be in his biography, and that's Nero's relationship with the military and war. Might seem bizarre, but bear with me. And then the third thing, if I have time at the end, is just a little bit of a glimpse into some of the ways that Nero's musical life has been used to characterize him in his afterlife, including to characterize his destructive element at the time of the apocalypse. So hopefully we'll get to that. So to begin then, I wanted to start with a coin that is on display at the British Museum for the Nero exhibition currently. They don't have that wonderful inscription, but they do have this, which is a coin with Nero, of course, on the obverse, quite recognisable there, probably from other depictions we've seen today. And then on the reverse, Apollo, a characterization of Apollo that I think was once thought to be sort of a Neronian Apollo, but the British Museum sign is very clear that they think it's just Apollo, holding a lyre. And this coin is from 62. So the lyre is a cithara, hence the title of the paper. And this is a very well-known visual representation of Nero, the idea of him being enchanted by music and enchanted by the lyre in particular. And it also seems to be confirmation of what the literary sources tell us, that Nero was obsessed with Apollo and obsessed with playing the lyre. So it fits quite nicely into a narrative of Nero's musical life. So the literary sources that we have to go on, as it were, are primarily reinforce this idea that he was extremely interested in music, but also do really tell us the extent to which he went with this. It's not just getting up on stage in Naples and performing, we will come to that, or singing while Rome burnt, but also he dedicated a lot of time to this. This was a serious pursuit for him. So Suetonius, who's very interested in this aspect of Nero's biography, tells us that having gained some knowledge of music in addition to the rest of his early education, as soon as he became emperor, he sent for Terpnus, the great master of the lyre in those days, so another member of Nero's court. And after listening to him sing after dinner for many successive days until late at night, he little by little began to practice himself, neglecting none of the exercises which artists of that kind are in the habit of following to preserve or strengthen their voices. For he used to lie upon his back and hold a leaden plate on his chest, purge himself by a syringe and by vomiting, and deny himself fruits and all foods injurious to the voice. Finally, encouraged by his progress, although his voice was weak and husky, bit of a jibe there, but we'll go with it. He began to long to appear on stage, and every now and then, in the presence of his intimate friends, he would quote a Greek proverb meaning hidden music counts for nothing. So Nero here is not just interested in singing, he's interested in making his voice better, continually better. He wants to not only learn from the best people, from the greatest master of the lyre, for example, but also he wants to find different methods, medical methods, Pliny talks about this as well, to make his voice better. He's interested in developing his own techniques, and he's also interested in instruments and how they work as well. Of course, this account is couched in some of the ways of thinking about music and the relationship with Rome. So it's a Greek pursuit rather than a Roman pursuit. But I think from it, we can still take some of that curiosity of Nero and the intent of Nero to make his knowledge as much as good as it can be in terms of how he pursues his music. So Pliny the Elder then also talks about this in his Natural History, and a couple of years ago at the Roman Society, 2018, I think it was actually, so 3 years ago, Matthew Lee gave a brilliant presentation on lots of Neronian parts of the natural history. So that's also available online. So I won't repeat all of that, but because it was wonderful. But this is just a few things that directly relate to his voice and his singing. So he makes the chive important. If you didn't know it was important, it is. Because on certain fixed days of every month, he always ate chives preserved in oil and nothing else, not even bread, for the sake of his voice. And then we also get that idea of the lead plate again from Pliny. So lead, in medicine, lead is used itself to remove scars, and leaden plates are applied to the region of the loins and kidneys for their comparative chilly nature, to check the attacks of venereal passions and the libidinous dreams that cause spontaneous emissions to the extent of constituting a kind of disease. That's one way to use them. The other way is how Nero does it. It is recorded that the pleader Calvus used these plates to control himself and to preserve his bodily strength for laborious study. Nero, whom heaven was pleased to make emperor, used to have a plate of lead on his chest when singing songs fortissimo, thus showing a method for preserving his voice, the voice. So again, couched in a story of the good and bad use of lead plating, the sexual aspect of that as well. But Nero, again, making use of a method, perhaps for the first time, I don't know, for this particular use, and extending his knowledge to be able to do so. So he's pushing this inquiry forward, I think. So back to some of the story about how Nero develops his instruments as well, his idea about instruments as well as his voice. We're jumping forward in time a little bit, but just indulge me. On the eve of Vindex's revolt, or when Nero hears about Vindex revolting right at the end of Nero's reign, when he's just come back from Naples in AD 68, he hears about this, and he, instead of kind of dealing with this problem, this military problem in full, in the way that one might expect, he gets very excited about some water organs. So we're told not even on his arrival did he personally address the Senate or people, but called some of the leading men to his house, and after a hasty consultation spent the rest of the day in exhibiting some water organs of a new and hitherto unknown form, explaining their several features and lecturing on the theory and complexity of each of them. And he even declared that he would presently produce them all in the theatre with the kind permission of Vindex. So he is thinking of a way to deal with Vindex's revolt, just again, not one we might expect, but he's very interested in the water organs, and not just a play, he's exhibiting, and Cassius Dio pulls this up even more so. He took the foremost senators and equestrians and as if in some communication to them regarding the political situation, said, "I've discovered a way by which the water organ will produce louder and more musical tones." In such jests did he indulge even at this crisis. So he's not just getting up and performing to these leading senators and equestrians, he is showing them and talking to them about how the water organs work, all these different kinds, how you can produce louder tones, how you can make them better, pushing that inquiry forward again, even if not in the circumstance we might expect him to be thinking about water organs. So Nero, if we go back to his theatre performance life, he for a while only performed in front of the court and his friends. So this again kind of ties in with the idea of an emperor performing, but not really being able to perform on a public stage. He does in AD 64, but not until AD 64. He did make an appearance in the theatre in AD 59 at the Juvenilia, where he stood on stage wearing the garb of a lyre player. He uttered the words, "My lords, of your kindness give me ear," and this Augustus sang to the lyre some pieces called Attis and the Bacchantes, while the soldiers stood by and all the people that the seats would hold sat watching. Again, slight and indistinct voice, Cassius Dio picking up on Suetonius's jibe there, directly or indirectly, and he moved the whole audience to laughter and tears at once. Quite a good, well, good, maybe bad thing to be able to do. Certainly difficult, I would suggest. After this performance, he entertained the people at a feast on the boats on the site of the naval battle given by Augustus. Thence at midnight, he sailed through a canal into the Tiber. So one of the things that I want to pick up here, we have the curiosity that he has for music, his ability to perform. He will make his voice better and better. He's interested in how instruments work. But from the historiography point of view, from Cassius Dio and Suetonius in particular, we'll see in a minute, we also have an idea that there is a relationship and a contrast between his love of music and a scenario of war. So while he is up on stage, while he is singing, we have soldiers in the audience who are watching this performance. They are watching the people, of course, that are watching Nero as well. But also afterwards, you have him giving a feast on the site of a naval battle given by Augustus. And of course, this highlights Nero doing what he shouldn't be doing. He should be paying more attention to the affairs of state, and he should not be singing. But it's also a very interesting way of tying his theatrical performances into a very specific idea of what he is not doing. He is not a military emperor. He sends Corbulo out to Parthia, of course, but he does not go himself, and he is very much more interested in this. So we start to get at this point, and it ramps up more and more, the idea that the juxtaposition of music and war work well as a way of talking about Nero and his inadequacies. So as Nero decides to perform in public, then the implications of this get more serious. He performed in public for the first time, not in Rome, but in Naples. So Tacitus says that he really wanted to appear on stage. He'd appeared in his palace or in the gardens before, but he hadn't ever played somewhere that was good enough for his ample voice. And he didn't dare to do this in Rome, but he decided to do so in Naples for the first time. And this is, as Dominic said, the event where the theatre literally shakes because there is an earthquake that takes place, and Nero does not let people leave through the earthquake. He's got a mob collected together to be spectators from the town, and they are drawn by rumours of the events from the neighbouring colonies and municipalities, the suite which attends the emperor whether in compliment or in various duties, and in addition a few maniples of soldiers filled the Neapolitan theatre. So again, the idea of the military and the theatrical crossing over, the soldiers there to be watching the audience, who are watching Nero, and Nero watching the audience and watching the soldiers, but also there as spectators. And Cassius Dio says something similar for when we go across to Achaia, when we go across to Greece. So Nero performs for the first time in Naples, but then in AD 66 goes over to Greece. Fortunately, we don't have Tacitus on this. This is part of his the lost section of his work, but we do have some Cassius Dio. And again, that now really the relationship between the acting and the military is, or the singing and the military is spelt out in quite a stark way. So Rome, according to Cassius Dio, was not enough for him. In contrast to Tacitus, he says that he didn't dare to perform in Rome. Apparently Rome was not enough for him, nor Pompey's theatre, nor the Great Circus, but he desired also a foreign campaign in order to become, as he said, victor in the grand tour. And a multitude, not only of the Augustans, which are people he trained to clap in a particular way, but of other persons as well, were taken with him, large enough if it had been a hostile host to have subdued both Parthians and all other nations. But they were the kind you would have expected Nero's soldiers to be, and the arms they carried were lyres and plectra, masks and buskins. The victories Nero won were such as befitted that sort of army, and he overcame Terpnus and Diodorus and Parmenes instead of Philip or Perseus or Antiochus. So Cassius Dio is really bringing out here in quite a concerted way the metaphor of the military campaign actually being undertaken by Nero as a musical campaign. He is going to perform, and a theatrical campaign, he's going to perform instead of the number of people he's taking with him are enough to be a huge collection of soldiers, but they are there to carry his lyres and his other musical instruments and to clap and to be spectators and to cheer in the audience as well. It's not necessarily surprising that there's an association between war and music being made by these authors. There's an implication of one also made by Augustus in terms of his relationship with Apollo, because Apollo, of course, is the god of music, but he also has a military aspect to him as well. And Augustus invoked Apollo and his lyre in the aftermath of Actium. So this is a coin minted in probably about 16 or 15 BC, a denarius minted in Rome, Augustus on the obverse, but on the reverse, you have the moneyer, the name of the moneyer, but also Apollo with a patera and altar of sacrifice, but also the lyre in the right hand as well. So that relationship between a military conquest, but also the musical aspect of Apollo with the lyre being drawn out there. So it's not maybe that surprising that when historiographers are thinking of ways to conceptualize how Nero works on stage, what his musical obsession and his musical curiosity has led to, it's a sort of badly done war scenario in a way that Augustus managed to do it much better. Suetonius, of course, also has the very famous story that when Nero returns from Rome and has his triumph and goes up to the temple of Apollo, he does that because of his musical victories in Greece, whereas Augustus had done that because of genuine military victory. So again, like the way that he uses the scene of a naval battle for a feast, where Augustus had used it with boats that actually had a military aspect to them. And also, I might be stretching it a bit here, but I'll carry on anyway. When we get the particular military campaign that does happen during Nero's reign, which is the campaign in Parthia, when Tiridates comes to be crowned in Rome, there is another mention of Nero singing the lyre and performing, and Tiridates is particularly disgusted by this, Cassius Dio tells us. he praised Corbulo, in whom he found only one fault, that he would put up with such a master. And again, the military and the music are clashing heads again on this occasion. The music of Nero's performance, singing and playing the lyre, driving a chariot as well, but the singing and lyre there again too, and the military occasion on which Tiridates is being crowned. And again, when we get the account of Corbulo's death, he is, some explain this, Cassius Dio says, by saying that Nero was about to appear as a lyre player and could not endure the idea of being seen by Corbulo when he wore the long ungirded tunic. The condemned man, Corbulo, as soon as he understood the order, seized a sword and, dealing himself a lusty blow, exclaimed, "You're Jew." Then, indeed, for the first time, he was convinced that he had done wrong, both in sparing the lyre player and in going to him unharmed. So this is Cassius Dio here again, playing up the ideas of how these two things are incompatible, the music and the military, in the way that Nero does it anyway. As we've seen, Augustus managed to do it a bit more successfully. And again, just to labour the point even more, when we get Galba's revolt in Spain, Nero again reacts completely inappropriately, and he ridiculed the leaders of the revolt in verse, set to wanton music, which have since become public, and accompanied them with gestures. Then, having assumed the fasces, he declared that he was leaving the dining room after a banquet, leaning on the shoulders of his comrades, that immediately on setting foot in the province, that he would go to the soldiers unarmed and do nothing but weep, and having thus led the rebels to change their purpose, he would next days rejoice among his rejoicing subjects and sing paeans of victory, which he ought at that very moment to be composing. So a bit like with Vindex, where he's looking at the water organs, the way that he conceptualizes dealing in this passage of Suetonius with a military event, with a revolt, with Galba revolting in Rome, is through music, is through composing verses and composing paeans of victory. So the two things are butting together once again. Now, and it also highlights Nero's confusion between theatres of war and theatres. So the idea that a theatre of war and a theatre of music, a theatre of performance, are inextricably linked, in his mind at least, seems to be coming through in these later anecdotes. And what I started to think about when I was looking at some of this was the idea of Neronian exceptionalism. What is it that, is this musical kind of habit and this confusion that he has, something that is intrinsically Neronian, something that very much signals him out as something that is different? And one of the things that sort of struck me, and I haven't quite made up my mind on this yet, but one of the things that sort of struck me is that when we look at his afterlife, when we look at, for example, the false Neros and a few accounts of, in the early Christian tradition of how Nero is understood, the music and the lyre come up again and again and again. So with the false Neros, this is Tacitus's version of the first false Nero, and he says that about this time, Asia and Achaia were terrified by false rumor of Nero's arrival. So, sorry, some context: Nero's died in Rome, but there are some reports coming from the east, from here Asia and Achaia, in Asia and Greece, that Nero didn't die, but he actually fled, and he is building up an army, and he's going to come back. So the reports with regard to his death had been varied, and therefore many people imagined and believed that he was still alive. The forces and attempts of other pretenders we shall tell as we proceed. We've lost some bits of Tacitus, unfortunately, but at this time a slave from Pontus, or as others have reported, a freedman from Italy, who was skilled in playing the cithara and in singing, gained the readier belief in his deceit through these accomplishments and his resemblance to Nero. So I found this interesting because I think this is sort of the start perhaps of an idea of signalling Nero's exceptionalism through his music and through his lyre playing particularly, which may be surprising in the aftermath of his death. It's not his murdering everyone that identifies him as Nero. It's not him using poison. It's not any of the things that we might readily associate with him now when we think of Nero and his tyranny, his murderousness and his tyranny, but rather it's his music, it's his cithara, the playing on the cithara and the singing that leads to the association with Nero of this false pretender. That's how he firms up for people to believe that he's Nero. And finally, this crosses over, not entirely straightforwardly, I will admit, but to some extent into the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. So the Sibylline oracles, the Judeo-Christian Sibylline oracles, which are dated to probably around the early 2nd century AD, so around the same sort of time as we get, Tacitus writing and such. Nero, a Nero-like figure who is, identified in various ways, appears as the bringer of destruction. He is not a re-risen Antichrist. He hasn't died and come back, but rather this plays on that false Nero idea that he has fled to the east and comes back and will bring about destruction in a sort of supernatural way. There are a few instances of this in the Sibylline oracles, but I've just given a couple of references there. This particular section says, when a great king of great Rome, a godlike man from Italy, will cut the ridge of the isthmus. So of course, that's something Nero does, not just Nero, tries to cut through the isthmus, but is a thing Nero does. Him, they say, Zeus himself begot with Lady Hera. Playing at theatricals with honey-sweet songs, rendered with melodious voice, he will destroy many men and his wretched mother. Now, one of the things there that is most distinctly Neronian, perhaps, is that playing at theatricals with honey-sweet songs rendered. The isthmus is a good giveaway as well, but if you just had the isthmus, you might wonder, is this a reference to Nero? Is it a reference to one of the others who tried to do that? Similarly, the murder of his mother is a good giveaway as well, but others murdered mothers. The playing at the theatricals and honey-sweet songs rendered with melodious voice is quite telling. And of course, the three of them together gives an undisputable idea that this is Nero. So it becomes emphasized, it's the same time as it's being emphasized in his historiography, in the historiographical tradition, the way of identifying Nero being partly through his music. But I just want to end by saying, while Nero is definitively the lyre player, not all references to lyres and references to Nero, I don't think. So my final example is one where I think we can sometimes perhaps get carried away with this, as maybe I have here a little bit too much. So one of the ways that Nero is understood in the Christian tradition is to be the beast from the sea in Revelation. Now, I personally don't think he was necessarily written in by John to be understood as the only way of interpreting the beast in Revelation. I think there are ambiguities in the text and internal references to other parts of what is now the Bible that are important as well. But one of the passages that's used by an incredibly prolific and extraordinary scholar, George Van Curten, whose work is wonderful, but I don't always agree, is one of the ways in which Van Curten understands Nero as being in Revelation is through a reference to the lyre. So Van Curten says, you can see there in chapter 15, John describes those who have been victorious against the beast and his image as standing beside the heavenly sea of glass, holding lyres, ekontas kitharas, which God has given them, and singing songs. This is an extraordinary mirroring of the figure at whose hands they suffered Nero, who performed and even took part in competitions as lyre player and was ill reputed for that practice. Which is a very interesting way to interpret that passage, I think, but it is perhaps slightly ambiguous when we think of the beast in Revelation, the beast of the sea, not actually being depicted as playing the lyre himself. This is a mirroring, but we don't get the beast playing the lyre. And also across the Bible, and this is just a couple of examples, there are other references, internal references to the lyre, the cithara, that I think perhaps explain this better. So Daniel, which is an incredibly important text for Revelation, has the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, and the herald proclaiming aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples of nations and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, kitharas, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." And also in the apocalyptic setting in particular, Isaiah, talking about the impending judgment on earth, talks about the mirth of the lyre being stilled. That's one of the things will happen. Also, no longer will they drink wine with singing. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. So there are ways of, I think, to kind of sum up the exceptionalism that I think of with Nero and the lyre, I think can be seen through some of the references that we have to him, particularly when you're trying to identify a clearly Neronian figure as Nero. It's a way of confirming that. But the lyre also has another tradition and separate traditions across across literature that have nothing to do with Nero at all. So we also need to make sure that we don't put Nero where he doesn't always belong. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Could I please introduce myself? I'm Roland Mayer. I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Society. And I want, first of all, to thank Dominic and Siobhan for accepting our invitation 18 months ago to put together this colloquium. And of course, thank all four speakers for such a varied and fascinating range of takes on Nero. I particularly want to thank the Executive Secretary, Dr. Fiona Hara. She actually does everything. And she was ably supported by Louise Wallace. They were here yesterday afternoon sorting out all this machinery so that things would go as smoothly as possible today. As Tim said at the outset, we had hoped to have or we have managed to have a complimentary colloquium with the exhibition just across the road in the British Museum. That exhibition, fortunately, was postponed because of COVID. It might not have been. They could have just cancelled the whole thing. So we're very fortunate that it did take place, and that our complimentary symposium has also taken place. We had hoped to get a special visit to the exhibition for members of the Roman Society, but that has not been possible. But fortunately, Fiona, with great persistence, has landed the BM's curator of classical Greek and Roman sculpture, Thorsten Opper, who will address the Society from the British Museum on the 19th of October at 6 p.m. Fiona will be informing everybody of that, but that will be exclusively, I believe, exclusively for members of the Society. Another thing that we're arranging, Fiona and I, is a day out in Colchester, a place I've never been before, but some of you will know that it was once the capital of the province of Britannia. And the museum there has currently an exhibition called Decoding the Roman Dead. Decoding the Roman Dead. And we're in touch both with the one of the curators there, and we think we're going to go on Saturday, the 4th of December. Again, information will come out to the Society, but it turns out that Colchester is awash with Roman stuff. They found the circus there about 5-10 years ago. And so we're also arranging a visit to that, and we'll be shown it, and they've got a cafeteria there, so we'll have lunch. And then we'll toddle on down to the museum. And when you go on a special tour to the basement of the museum, you'll see the foundations, or we will see the foundations of the Temple of Claudius. So we're hoping to have a jolly day out in December. So all I can say really is watch this space. You will be informed. But now it's time for us to give our speakers and attendees a drink. And also to celebrate Rupert Morris's birthday. Happy birthday, Rupert.